All right. So we've also been studying different ceremonies related to covenants, such as exchanging what? Tell me some things that, okay, belts, weapons, what else? Robes, maybe sharing a covenant meal, having a memorial to represent the fact that a covenant was established. Now we're going to try to put these pieces back together, and we're going to look specifically at the three main covenants God established in his word and see how they relate to each other. I mean, think about it for a minute. Have you ever wondered why God gave the old covenant in between the Abrahamic covenant and the new covenant? The old covenant, the law, it could save no one because no one is able to keep it perfectly. Well, hopefully we're going to see if we can figure this out as we begin our own walk through the Old Testament. And today we're going to focus on Genesis and the first part of Exodus. I know it seems like we keep reviewing the same events repeatedly, but I think you're going to discover these passages take on deeper meaning each time we revisit, because God will reveal something new or remind us of a central truth as we revisit these verses. So we first see the mention of Abram appear at the end of Genesis 11. Yes, ma'am. Oh, dear. Thank you so much. I forgot to turn the thing on. I set it up. It's on my screen. Appreciate you telling me that before we get any further into it. So let's see. Why do I not see a green light? There it goes. Give me a second.
While Jan's doing that, the bucket and the passing method got for the prayer sheet and the bucket. Raise your hand if you've not had the bucket or the prayer sheet. Oh, okay. Okay. So just for a review, we go down this side, and then when we get here, this person gets to the back, you go across the back, then you come to the front again.
Okay. So this message was brought to you by, we had some technical difficulties. We'll see if we can get back into the swing of things. All right. Bucket issue solved and overhead issue solved. I'm going to hit one of those lights though, so it's a little easier to see the screen. All right. So we said Abram first appears at the end of Genesis 11. But in Genesis chapter 12, that's when we begin to see God at work in the life of Abram. He speaks with Abram, tells him to go forth to the land that God will show him. And so let's start listing the promises that God makes to Abram beginning here. I tell you what, I might need one more of those back on if it's possible. Oh, there we go. James is on his way. All right. So let's look at the fact that even though the covenant ceremony between God and Abram doesn't take place until Genesis 15, covenant promises really begin in Genesis 12. So if you're in Genesis 12, I want us to focus on verses 2 and 3. And I'm going to condense these just a little bit and summarize them into 3 points that we want to look at. The first one, God promises to make Abram a great nation. Now, that great nation is who? Israel, exactly. He also tells Abram that he will be blessed. So I've kind of put those together as point number 1. Here's another thing God promises. He tells Abram that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in Abram. Well, if that's all the nations of the earth, not the nation he becomes, that means this is the group of what? Gentiles, exactly. The group of Gentiles will be blessed in Abram throughout the earth. Keep thinking about that. We're going to come back to it. Hopefully you'll be able to tell me in a minute what that actually means as far as the blessing that's received. And then the third one, again, kind of summarizing a little bit, is God says, those who bless you, and we can think about this as Israel, because we know Abram becomes the great nation of Israel. So those who bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. And really, this is both an individual and as a nation. kind of promise that God is making here. So Abram follows God in obedience. He takes his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and he heads out to unknown places because God just said, I want you to go until I show you the land that I'm giving you, right? And he's 75 at this age. Now, along the way, we see a few highs and lows in Abram's life. In Genesis 12, we see he encounters in part of his journeys, his sojournings. There was a concern that he was afraid his life might be taken by Pharaoh. So obviously he's in lands controlled by Egypt. So he tells a little half truth. He just tells Pharaoh that Sarai is his sister. Now, she's actually not his full sister, but his what? Half sister. What he neglects to tell Pharaoh is she's also his wife. Now, I have to say, ladies, I think about this. Abram was 75. That meant Sarah was how old? She was 10 years younger. She was 65. So those of you who are kind of like me, take heart. Abraham was concerned that his 65-year-old wife was good looking enough that Pharaoh would want to kill him and take her for himself. So ladies, it's not too late. Your husband still sees you as a valuable treasure, okay? But you know what? God shows Abram he is more than capable to intervene on Abram's behalf when Abram has a problem, if only he would trust God. So we go along, the possessions, because God is blessing Abram, his possessions and his nephew's Lot's possessions grow to the point the land can't sustain both of them. So they're up on a hill, and he lets Lot choose which land he wants to take for himself. And Abram says, that's fine. I'll live on this part. And God speaks. So we're now in Genesis chapter 13. I'm going to read to you verses 14 through 17. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Now, from this passage, what else is God now promising to Abram? What did he say? I'm giving you, that's right, a specific land. A specific land. And when he made this promise, to whom is it given? Just Abram? And his descendants for how long? Forever. Okay. Now, following this, Abram goes on a rescue mission to free Lot after Lot has been taken captive. And so the king of Sodom offers to give Abram the spoils of his victory, but Abram refuses to take anything because he had sworn to the Lord God Most High he would not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything from the king of Sodom, lest the king of Sodom would say he had made Abram rich. Now, here's the point. Abram was more concerned about honoring God's reputation than receiving anything from man for himself. There's a lesson for us to learn in that we can apply to our lives today. We live in a world where most people are more concerned about finding government entitlements, freebies, or loopholes to enlarge their own bank accounts than having concern about how this lifestyle affects the perception others have of God. God shares just enough about Abram's life to show us he is indeed a man, one who doesn't walk perfectly with God, yet a man who has committed his ways to following God. Then we get to Genesis 15. And it begins with God speaking to Abram again. And he tells Abram not to fear because God is a shield to him. And Abram's reward will be very great. So at this point, Abram brings up the subject of being childless. Now, think about it. Is this culture, is in this period of time, which is about 2000 BC, somewhere in that area, being childless was about the worst thing that could happen to you. There would be no one to whom your legacy would be passed, and the number of sons that a man had was related to the honor he would receive from others. So Abram proposes solution number one to God, and that's what? Make who his heir? His servant, Eleazar. And what did God say? Nope, that's not my plan. You will have one come forth from your own body to be your heir. Now, we read in Genesis 15, verse 5. He took him outside and said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. Now, that is the translation in the NASB. So shall your descendants be. But we've studied this repeatedly. And we know that translating it as descendants is not accurate with the literal Hebrew word that's used, because the Hebrew word is what? Seed, singular, not plural. And so when we cross-reference this verse with Galatians 3:16, we see the real meaning of God's promise. In Galatians 3:16, now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to seeds, as referring to many, but rather to one. And to your seed, that is who? Christ. Exactly. So the fifth promise in this Abrahamic covenant is the promise of a seed, and we know that seed is Christ when we cross-reference with Galatians 3:16.
Are you in verse 4?
I am in verse 5 of Genesis 15.
Because I'm really kind of disturbed
Okay, what is it?
that my Bible says from your own body.
Yes, it does say from your own body.
It doesn't say anything about seed.
Well, it says from your own body, there will be, that's where your heir will come. But then in verse 5, that's when God says to him, so shall your descendants be. So at the end of verse 5, what does your translation say?
So shall your descendants be.
Yes, and that's the word, if you go to the Hebrew for descendants, it's the literal, in the Hebrew, singular word for seed. It's not plural. And that's where Paul gives us the explanation in Galatians 3:16, that that's the promise of Christ. When he said that to Abram, it's not the promise that you're just going to have more and more and more descendants, although we know that occurs in order to get to the actual seed. Make sense?
Yeah.
And the King James did there's sometimes, and I'll say many times, the King James does a really good job of being very literal in the translation. The problem is sometimes it's a little harder to understand. But yes, I think we run into, and this is where, is the Bible inerrant?
No.
Well, the Bible, God's word, is inerrant, but do translators sometimes mistranslate or not necessarily get the right word in the right place all the time? And that's where we've got to go back and look at what the original language says so that we don't get confused. So if I was cross-referencing that King James with my NASB, and hers says seed and mine says descendants, it should trigger in my mind, something doesn't look the same here. There's a problem. And that's where a little bit of digging to go back and figure out what was the Hebrew word used here and what does it actually mean to get the right translation. I have a footnote in my Bible that when you see descendants, it's got the little number beside it to help me go look at the footnote. And it tells me there the literal word was seed. So if you
from your body is what confuses.
Well,
But then you think it's gonna be his son
so,
from his body.
and remember, and I'm glad you brought this up because verse 4, remember, this came after Abram said, well, how about you make Eleazar my heir? And that's when God said, no, your heir will come from your body. So he's actually going to have a child he sires, but that's not specifically who the seed is. And yes, it is confusing unless we have Galatians 3:16 to help amplify what that means. I thought I had my phone on silent. Let me just double check. So let's look at the fact that at this point, has God asked anything in return from Abram? I mean, we've got 5 things listed up here that God has promised. Has he asked anything in return from Abram at this point? It looks to me like this is just all stuff God has promised, right? But if we get to verse 6 in Genesis 15, this is a pivotal point where we read, then he, Abram, believed in the Lord and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. What just happened to Abram? He's what? He's been saved. He is saved by God. When a man is reckoned or declared as righteous by God, it shows salvation because the righteousness of man is as filthy rags. Listen to the first half of Isaiah 64, verse 6. Isaiah 64, verse 6 says, but we're all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. Man has no righteousness that can be presented to God as anything other than filthy rags. So how was Abram saved?
Right.
The same way that you and I are saved. It's by faith in Christ. And when that happens, you are imputed with the righteousness of God. In other words, his righteousness covers you. And the difference in our faith and Abram's faith or belief was that his was looking forward to the coming seed. In other words, the coming Messiah that was promised by God. Salvation in the Old Testament was based on the belief that God would bring his Christ one day because God is a covenant-keeping God. And we now receive salvation when we look back at the work of Christ to see his Jesus' death, his burial, and his resurrection, and that brings us new life to those of us who had been dead men walking before coming to Christ in faith. So it's the same way that men are saved, Old Testament and New. And so what we see, God reiterates his promise of the land. In verse 7, he tells Abram to bring the animals necessary for the covenant ceremony. He cuts them in half, other than he didn't cut what in half? The birds. And he tells Abram to wait until dusk. And then God causes Abram to sleep, or you might say he just kind of immobilizes him. And he says these words to Abram, that his descendants will be enslaved in a foreign land for how long? 400 years, but God will return them back to his promised land after that period. And he tells Abram that he will be buried at a good old age and go to his fathers in peace. And then we see God himself in the form of a smoking oven and a flaming torch that passes between the pieces of flesh in that covenant ceremony. And we know it's the covenant ceremony because verse 18 clearly states, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram. And then we see the restatement of the promise of the land with some very specific information about how far the land extends. That's key as we continue on in this lesson. Now, we need to look at one more passage in Genesis related to the Abrahamic Covenant. Of course, we know that in Genesis 16, we read of Abram and Sarai's decision that maybe God meant the promise of that child that Abram needs to sire is to come through Hagar, my maidservant. That was Sarai's idea, which Abram signed off on. And so now we see solution number 2 proposed by Abram. And in their zeal to help God fulfill his promise, they produced who? Ishmael. And his name means a wild donkey. Isn't that such a, wouldn't you hate to have to live up to that name? I think Ishmael did. Yeah. Be careful what you name your kids. I believe we have another theophany. Remember that from last week in Genesis 16, one of those appearances of the pre-incarnate Christ. Genesis 16, verses 11 and 12. The angel of the Lord comes and speaks to Hagar. Remember, Sarai's been abusive toward her. She runs away. And the angel tells her she will bear a son whose hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. Would you say this prophecy has been fulfilled? Oh, yeah. And when Ishmael is 13, we now arrive at Genesis chapter 17. God speaks to Abram again. And this time, Abram is 99. We're going to begin in verse 4. He says, God says, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So we see God change Abram's name to Abraham, giving him a part of his own name as part of that covenant ceremony, the sign of being in covenant. He does the same for Sarai a few verses later by changing her name to Sarah. And what do you see regarding the promises in those verses that I just read? Was there anything new here, or is this just another reiteration of all the ones God's already spoken? You see anything new? What does it say in verse 4? You will be the father of a multitude or many nations. Now, prior to this, God told Abram he would become a great nation and that all the nations would be blessed in him. But this refers to his descendants establishing many nations, many different nations. Was this fulfilled?
Yes, we grafted. Is that it?
Well, we are grafted in, but as far as the many nations, here's kind of the direction that I was thinking. We know that through Isaac, the child of promise, he's the father, one of the patriarchs of Israel, right? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But what is Ishmael the father of? All those Arab nations. Is that a multitude of nations? That is a multitude of nations. So we see that being fulfilled. God also says, and I think this is interesting, look in verse 7. He says he will be God to you and to your descendants after you, as he's speaking to Abraham. Now, in a sense, this is a more personal promise than ones we've seen before. God's made promises about blessings and about the land and nations, but this is taking it down to an individual level. And this covenant lasts how long? Forever. Now, God then tells Abraham that he and his descendants and male servants must be circumcised as a sign of this covenant. We talked about that in great detail last week. Don't forget, when was Abraham saved? Back in Genesis 15, right? Which was about 14 years before this occurs. So circumcision never saved anyone. It was required only as a sign of the covenant that God made with Abraham. Changing his name was a sign also.
To identify him as a different person
Yes,
for the name.
yes, that was a sign also. And that didn't occur until this passage, which means it was 14 years after God declared him as being righteous. Did you have something you wanted to add, Ken? Baptism is just a sign. It doesn't save us today. So we've got to be careful we don't get confused about the fact that a sign will not bring salvation. This salvation comes only by faith in Christ.
Yeah, the song makes me think, Father Abraham.
Mhm.
Makes sense now. You think it as a kid to be, Father Abraham had many sons, had two eyes, one and so are you. I mean, so now you're like, oh, I get that song.
You know, that is so true, Amy. There's so many things that when you're a kid and you learn those little Bible songs, and the theology behind it a lot of times doesn't make any sense until you're much older and you go back and go, oh, I get that now. So yes, I'm with you on that. So here's what we know. Abraham followed God's command in obedience. And at the age of 100, when Sarah was 90, the promised son Isaac was finally born. He grows up. In Genesis 24, we read of Abraham sending his servant back to the land of Abram's relatives to find a bride for Isaac because he did not want Isaac to have a Canaanite woman for his wife. Sounds like it could be a lesson in there, parents. Not that I'm proposing we go back to arranged marriages, but nevertheless, Rebecca is selected. She agrees to return to become Isaac's bride. And Isaac and Rebecca have twin sons who famously wrestled in the birth canal. I don't know that there's any woman who could read that without just grimacing in pain. And who emerged first? You remember which one came first? Esau. He was named that because he was red and fairy all over, and he's the father of the Edomites, and Edom means red. And who was clutched to his heel? Jacob, exactly. Before they were born, the Lord had prophesied to Rebekah in Genesis 25, after she inquired of the Lord about this intense wrestling going on in her womb. Ever felt that, ladies? And in verse, not necessarily from twins, you can have one that's very active, but I can't imagine two. So in verse 23 of Genesis 25, it says, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body, and one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So we know that despite Esau being the favorite of his father Isaac, we know there's a lot of lessons there. Don't pick favorites, people. The son who was a man's man. He was the outdoorsman, the hunter, the more power kind of guy. God had chosen the younger Jacob to be the one through whom the covenant promises would pass. Despite Jacob's character flaws, what was he known as? He's a trickster. Exactly. We see God work in his life to change his character somewhat. Isn't it true that God often uses the principle of reaping what you sow to get our attention and to grow us? So what we see is Jacob, the trickster, tricked by his uncle Laban into 14 years of servitude in order to marry the woman he loves, Rachel. He gets a bonus wife as part of the bargain, Rachel's older sister, Leah. And between these 2 wives and their maids, he becomes the father of how many sons? 12, who become the 12 tribes of Israel, right? And along the way, we see various times that God speaks to Isaac, to Jacob, and to Joseph, the favorite son of Jacob. Each time confirming God's presence in their lives and his commitment to his covenant. And we know that despite Joseph's brothers' intent to bring harm to Joseph, when those jealous brothers threw him into a pit and sold him into slavery, which took him to Egypt, it was actually part of God's plan to use Joseph for good for his people. And shortly after Joseph is elevated to a rank just below Pharaoh and is able to preserve the lives of many by obediently following God's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams, we read in the end of Genesis how all of his family comes to Egypt to survive the famine. Now go back for a minute. You remember the prophecy that God made to Abraham regarding his descendants being in bondage back in Genesis 15? Once that Pharaoh dies and a new one arises who didn't know Joseph, what happened to the Israelites? They were put in bondage to the Egyptians. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. You can be the most famous or even the most powerful person in the world, but within a few years of your death, no one will remember you. I think we often get distracted by the idea of leaving a legacy for future generations. But you know what? The reality is when we go to be with the Lord, our memory will fade quickly on this earth. I mean, how many times have you thought of some celebrity that passed away at some point, and maybe it impacted you when it happened, but a few years later, you're like, I can't remember. Is so-and-so still alive? And you have to look online to find out. Okay. The truth is the memory of you and me will fade. But the legacy we want to leave behind is that God is faithful to his covenant. That's what really matters. What looked like an utter act of ungratefulness for all that Joseph had done was instead God fulfilling his covenant promise he had made to Abraham. Remember back in Genesis 15, after he told Abraham that his descendants would be in bondage for 400 years? Listen to verse 16. He said, then in the fourth generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. God had prophesied this would happen, but it wouldn't happen until the iniquity of the Amorite was complete. The bondage and eventual deliverance of Israel was predetermined by God because he sees all. And he was waiting on the Amorites to reach a certain level of sinfulness before putting this prophecy into motion. Next time you find yourself in a battle and you're struggling and you don't understand why God is not yet delivering, it may be because he sees all and he's waiting on something else to be fulfilled first before that deliverance can come. Yeah.
Okay, that's your view on the Amorites. From you, not from me. Can you give us a best?
Well, I cannot. Yeah, I would need to go back and research just a little bit to see the exact encounter that is going to involve the Amorites. That I know there are issues related to when they go into the promised land, but I'm thinking we have some things at this point before they go into bondage, and probably what's happening, and this is what let me just kind of step off. I'm not speaking as somebody who is speaking with authority here. I'm kind of trying to connect some dots. I don't think we're going to find anything specific until the Israelites start to go into the promised land, that we then start hearing about these battles with the Amorites. I think what God is saying is, while all this is going on and the Israelites are in bondage in Egypt, the Bible's not recording it, but the Amorites are out here doing some really nasty things. And they're getting more sinful and more sinful, kind of like when Jonah went to preach in Nineveh. Did we get anything in the Bible beforehand about what was going on in Nineveh? But Jonah knew they were wicked people. So that's what I think this is probably referencing. They were just a wicked people. They just hadn't yet gotten to the point that God said, hammer time, I'm going to deal with you.
And then he was going to use the Israelites to hammer time.
And he was going to use the Israelites for hammer time when they came out of Egypt. So yes, I think that's my interpretation of that, because I don't think we're going to find it in God's word as far as anything they did specifically until we see that encounter. Okay, so we're at the point where the book of Exodus opens with the children of Israel suffering under harsh rule because Pharaoh has decreed for the Hebrew midwives to do what? Throw all those Hebrew male babies in the Nile River. But do the midwives do it? No, they're able to give some excuse. And so eventually what we see is in Exodus 1:22, Pharaoh makes this decree. He commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So it's no longer the midwife's responsibility. He's telling the Jews, that's what you are to do. Now, we do know that there was a Levite couple who instead placed their baby boy in a basket before putting him in the Nile, goes down the river, and his sister Miriam watches as Pharaoh's daughter draws the baby out of the river and decides to raise him as her own. Who is this baby? Moses. And we have studied along with Brother Sam in Exodus how he eventually fled Pharaoh's house after killing an Egyptian in defense of a fellow Hebrew. He went to Midian, he married, he had 2 sons, he met God at the burning bush. We know he went back to Egypt along with his brother Aaron. God worked through them to bring how many plagues? 10 plagues. And all the time when he would go to Pharaoh to say, let my people go, Pharaoh would say, no. Despite the devastation brought by continuing to reject God, Pharaoh persists to refuse until after the 10th plague, which was what? Death of the firstborn. Exactly. And we see the Egyptians at this point giving gold and all kinds of valuable items to the Israelites if they would just get out of town. Leave us, please. We then see the parting of the Red Sea, various miraculous provisions by God as they journey to Mount Sinai, and we will pick up soon with the giving of the law or the Old Covenant. So here's what I want us to do to close out. We're going to go back to these promises outlined in the Abrahamic Covenant. So that's our focus for today. First, we know that a great nation, Israel, will come through Abraham. If you think about it, this was given to Abraham as a promise at about 2000 BC. By 1500 to 1400 BC, in that range, less than 500 years after this prophecy that God gave to Abraham, Israel has become so great that they are seen as a threat to the dominant empire of the day, Egypt. Now, the truth is, very few of the nations that were in existence at this time are still around today. Would you agree? I mean, when was the last time you met a Hittite? I haven't. Yet 4,000 years after God promised Abraham that a great nation would come through his descendants, Israel still exists, despite having many, many, many years without a land. And I just want to outline a few of the major accomplishments that have come from this nation. Now, I personally find this first one astounding. I was not aware of it until I started researching this. Did you know that Israeli scientists have developed a way to turn algae into hard tissue? I'd say that's impressive. Okay. They are the ones who are credited with developing a system of crop irrigation, drip irrigation for crops. So that was also very impressive as far as the advances that it has brought to the world. Look at number 3. It's a small nation, yet they are among the top 20 world economies, and they're credited with establishing capitalism. How about that? All right, and I know you won't get all of these written down. So if there's anything that you find that you think is an interesting point, feel free to write it. Look at number 4. Per capita, they have the most museums, the most scientists and engineers, and they rebuilt the current nation they have from practically nothing since regaining a portion of their land in 1948. And they've turned it into a productive, agriculturally rich, economically strong nation. And they have one of the best trained and most effective armies in the world. Did we not get to see firsthand this week? I tell you what, did anybody have Fox News on this morning? This was, I thought, very fascinating. They were giving, unless you've kind of been in a hole, I'm going to assume that you heard this week about in Lebanon, all of these pagers that exploded and as people were just all over in this market area. Okay, so the thing is, what they were explaining, this was a 15-year development, 15-year plan that unfolded this week, because what Israel realized 15 years ago is, with all of these terrorist pockets, and we're talking Hezbollah right now, that they had figured out they couldn't carry around these anymore. Why? Whether you realize it or not, there is somebody who can pinpoint you precisely at any moment in time if you've got one of these. And so the Hezbollah commanders had told everybody that not only you, but your wives, your kids, anybody that is around you is no longer allowed to carry a cell phone. Otherwise, you're compromising our entire organization. So they began using pagers and walkie-talkies, radios. Walkie-talkie radios is how they stayed in communication. And that's what they've been doing to try to avoid detection all these years. So what their intelligence department did was they began making shell companies where they would, and some of it they would actually do, I mean, they have legitimate customers, but they began acting like they made walkie-talkies and they made pagers, and they became a subcontractor to who Hezbollah was ordering their pagers and their walkie-talkies from. And then they put like a very tiny amount of an explosive in the devices, along with, I'm sure, some tracking mechanisms and some other things, where they've been collecting information. Now, it's probably, I mean, this was years in the making, because I don't think it was until July of this year that they finally had the contract expand to the point that they felt confident most. And these were not the rank and file guys that were getting these. These are the commanders. These are the ones that they were concerned about. So once they finally felt like they had enough of those people who had the pagers either in their pocket, in their backpack, in their hands, and they had a good opportunity, they pulled the trigger, and hands were blown off, or faces were blown off, or other things were blown off if it was in their pocket. And we saw that take place this week. You can imagine the shock and horror that Hezbollah must have felt. The next day, what happened? The walkie-talkies started exploding. Now, I was telling John this morning, makes me think about years ago, we had our house broken into. Not that we had much of value, but if you've ever had that happen, you have that experience of feeling like you're safe and secure. And then when that happens, all of a sudden the realization, I'm not, occurs. That's where Hezbollah is right now. Yeah.
The thing about the papers, they didn't just blow up. They beat a couple of times, so they had time to pull them out.
Exactly.
Over 500 of them.
Yes, they made it like a message had been coming from the command center for Hezbollah, so that, yeah.
It was a very explosive message.
Thank you, John. Yes.
Back to the promise.
Yeah.
What I find so fascinating is it's Adam and Eve played all over again, because you've got Adam, his first conflict with God is to shuck his responsibility. It wasn't me, it was her fault. Then you got Abram goes into Egypt. The Egyptian king was considered a god. His first responsibility, he shucked it. Hey, my responsibility for my wife. No, she's not my wife.
Mm-hmm.
And then what's so great about it is they were removed from the promised land, and the flaming sword was placed there. And then you have the flaming sword as part of the covenant, and they're going back into the promised land. And this is God refulfilling, saying, hey, going right back to the seed, the devil just trying to destroy the seed. He kills the firstborn son of Adam and Eve. They don't have a firstborn son yet. Then they end up having one. And then it goes right into the devil again. Hey, kill all the firstborn sons again. It's he will nip at your heel and you will crush his head over and over and over again. on that.
I think that's a great point. And in fact, I'm glad you brought that up because we're about to segue into something kind of relates to that. So let me just mention quickly, we were talking about in the fact, if you go back to your list of what the promises of the covenant were, that all the nations will be blessed through you. Can you see how that's occurred when you look at all that Israel has done? But then when you look at the fact that those who bless you will be blessed, those who curse you will be cursed, okay? I think we're at a point, because we've already, well, let me not fast forward over this. The second one was the fact, I believe, that the fact that all the nations of the earth would be blessed in Abraham is really a reference to what? How is that going to happen? Through the gospel, right? I mean, ultimately, that's the issue, is the nations of the earth will be blessed through the sharing of the gospel. The ones who put their faith in God the same way, in Jesus Christ, that Abram did. That's the real blessing. But now I want us to look at these next two promises and consider them. God said he would bless those who bless you, talking about Israel, and curse those who curse you. So I want you to think about these nations that maybe has stood against Israel. And the first one you might think of is Egypt, because we've just been looking at an account where Egypt was obviously against Israel. And you may wonder, well, why are they still around? Now, although they enslaved the Jews and God dealt harshly with them to force Pharaoh to let them go, there were some times that Egypt has worked in cooperation with Israel. At one point, King Solomon married an Egyptian wife as a means of brokering a peace treaty between the countries. And even in the days after Jesus' birth, I think that kind of ties in what Zach was talking about here. Where did the angel tell Joseph to take Jesus to keep him safe? He went to Egypt when Herod was going to kill all those babies, okay? So Egypt has had its ups and downs with Israel over the years, but they haven't been a perpetual dogged enemy in the same way as some of these other nations. I mean, even now, Egypt is relatively friendly toward Israel compared to other Arab nations, especially since the Camp David Accords under President Carter. But I wouldn't necessarily place Egypt at the top of the list for world powers. I wouldn't say they've been blessed, but I don't see them as let's say that the sins of the Amorite are not yet complete. The sins of Egypt maybe are not yet complete. Kimmy?
Well, and in Revelation, there's a prophecy that Egypt will come and worship and eventually, I think, become saved.
So that's an excellent point. If we start cross-referencing, we will see God's not through with Egypt either. He's not through with Israel, but he's not through with Egypt. Now, many nations of antiquity are not existent now. We've already mentioned those Amorites, Edom, Assyria, Sodom, Babylon. They were all wiped out according to things we see in the prophets. There are no Hittites. That's why I haven't met one. Moabites, Philistines, all of them were stubbornly rebellious against the Lord. And we do know God used some of these nations to discipline Israel when Israel was rebellious toward God. But once they reached a point of sinfulness, God's hand of judgment came about and wiped these people out. But over the years, they got wiped out, and these lands have now been replaced with new nations that share the same hostilities toward Israel. Is there peace in this area? Why not?
Because God said there wasn't.
And ultimately, does it come back to the Abrahamic Covenant? It really does. God promised to curse those who curse Israel. He promised them a land. And we see ideologies now where strapping bombs to children is considered to be an act of worshiping Allah, or where raping Jewish women, mutilating and torturing Jews are seen as acts to be celebrated and praised. What do you think will be the ultimate fate of these countries?
Yeah.
Remember, God is a covenant-keeping God. Now, I want you to think about our country, the U.S. We were founded on the belief that we should have religious freedom from state interference. Now, not all of our founding fathers were Christian, but were many of them. They were. And you see biblical principles woven into the fabric of our Constitution. And over the years, has our country historically stood with Israel?
Yes.
Absolutely. But where do you see our nation today? Despite what happened on October 7th, 2023, we are almost 1 year from the anniversary of this date, when Hamas brutally and savagely murdered over 1,200 Jews and took more than 240 hostage. We see protests in this country almost daily supporting Hamas and being against Israel's right to defend itself. Okay? Now, our government has not yet capitulated to these pro-Hamas activists in this country. But do you see the real possibility coming?
If we can buy Israeli products that they're ever to show everything, especially in the north, while they're at war with Lebanon and Hezbollah. If there's any way that we can buy Israeli products or whatever online, whatever.
So Kelly makes an excellent point.
Know how to find Israeli products.
Well, yeah, I mean, as individuals, remember, we said these covenant promises, there's a national aspect to it, but there's also an individual personal aspect. And so I think he makes an excellent point. We need to do what we can. Sometimes it's just speaking up and making sure we don't get silenced. Makes me think of Holly just shared with me something that her job may be coming to an end soon because of something they want her to pledge that's ridiculous. That there are going to be times we're going to be faced with, what are you willing to put at risk in your life in order to stand for truth? And one of the big things we need to realize, God is a covenant keeping God, and we are called to stand with Israel. And the idea that when it says Israel is a child killer, you can see on one of these signs, and if you look in this bottom picture, I'm finding that, you know, they've got these tombstones, you know, death to the peace process, death to truthful reporting. I'm sorry, how? Yeah, I mean, it's the mindset is just very difficult to understand. And what's even more tragic is, where are many of these protests taking place? Our colleges, our kids are being indoctrinated. So we've got a responsibility to speak up and speak truth, but we also need to look for ways to financially support these countries. And that may mean we do a little research to find out how can we do that. So Krista, I'll let you speak and I'll go back to Kelly.
And we had talked about, and we talked about Sunday school about making that one of our missions that we can support as a class with our contributions to find a ministry and to be, you know, maybe the monthly supporters or whatever. And so we've done that before. I think we talked about it since. Maybe we might want to consider something.
I think that's an excellent point. We may need to revisit that, because we had sent some money through the Southern Baptist Convention as kind of a relief donation. And so we might want to, I will say you guys are extremely generous, and I feel like we're carrying, Karen's not here today, but we've been carrying a good balance that I know we can afford to support something else regularly. This might be something we need to look at. Is that okay with you guys if we investigate that, and we'll come back and present something to you before we do it? Okay, Kelly?
I was just going to say that I recently read a thing where Qatar has donated billions to our colleges and universities, and that's where all of this is coming from. All these upper presidents of these universities,
Yep.
so they're getting billions of dollars around, you know, and so they're doing what they're paid to, is to indoctrinate our kids at college level, and then they come out and teach our kids at the grade school level.
Yeah.
That's going on.
You know, this is a brand book of the Bible, comes out of Moody, and it is so good. And they'll tell you about a lot of these scientific finds every and a lot of Jewish, how to witness the Jews, how to support the Jews.
Excellent. Okay, so if you want to share that with me, I'll share it with everybody so that they would know where to look. So we're going to wrap this up real quickly. I just want to mention this. The other promise is the land. And that's a big part of what's going on with, if you notice the sign, and I know you've heard the chant, from the river to the sea. Okay, that's the pro-Palestinian cry. What does that mean? They want it all. They don't want to live with this. They want the land is honestly a big part of it. And I want you to look at where this land is located. I'm kind of zoomed in on Israel at the moment. Here's some key features. I mean, first of all, it's in that Fertile Crescent. It's wonderful, lush, productive land. If you look on the border between Jordan and Israel, you find the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea in and of itself is a gold mine for those nations because of all the minerals they can harvest. And then look at how much coastal land there is on the Mediterranean Sea. Why would that be important? You've got shipping, you've got a seaport that has access everywhere. Look at this larger map. Yes, I think so. I think so. It's not during the times of the Bible. It's going to be something current. Here's a little bit bigger region. We know that Russia actually plays into some end time prophecy coming against Israel. I want you to look way up at the north with Russia. I know you don't see the very top of Russia, but think about it in terms of that seaport. You've got the Caspian Sea on one side of Russia, the Black Sea on the other. What's the problem with those two? They're landlocked. That doesn't help them as a shipping port. So they have to go to the north side. What's the problem when you get up to the north side of Russia? It's frozen. Yeah, it's so cold that navigating is almost impossible. But if they could get access down to the Mediterranean Sea, you can see what benefit there is there. And Jordan is completely landlocked. So, there's some issues there. A lot of this is about the land, but God promised this land to Abraham and to his descendants for good reason. And he promised it forever. We're going to close by looking at the words of the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 30. He says, starting in verse 3, Jeremiah 33, "For behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel and Judah. The Lord says, I will also bring them back to the land that I gave to their forefathers, and they shall possess it." Has this been completely fulfilled yet? Not completely. They have some of the land. They don't have all of it. Keep reading. Verse 4. "Now these are the words which the Lord spoke concerning Israel and concerning Judah. For thus says the Lord, I have heard a sound of terror, of dread, and there is no peace. Ask now and see if a male can give birth. Why do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in childbirth? And why have all faces turned pale? Why are these men in obvious agony? What's made them turn pale?" Keep reading. Verse 7, "Alas, for that day is great. There is none like it. And it is the time of Jacob's distress. But he will be saved from it." Now, what is Jacob's distress? The tribulation. "It shall come about on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, that I will break his yoke from off their neck and will tear off their bonds, and strangers will no longer make them their slaves. But they shall serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, declares the Lord, and do not be dismayed, O Israel. For behold, I will save you from afar, and your offspring from the land of their captivity. And Jacob will return and will be quiet and at ease, and no one will make him afraid. For I am with you, declares the Lord, to save you, for I will destroy completely all the nations where I have scattered you. Only I will not destroy you completely, but I will chasten you justly and will by no means leave you unpunished." God has declared his covenant stands. He's not done with Israel. Every one of these covenant promises made to Abraham will come to pass. And the question is, where do you stand? Do you stand with Israel? Do you see why it matters whether or not our nation is an ally of Israel? The Abrahamic covenant is everlasting. So these promises matter. because they're still true today. Don't let the media or the culture of today try to persuade you otherwise. All right. So we're going to look next week at the old covenant, the law. And a big part of it involves the tabernacle. And so if you have the homework, there's a section that talks about the pieces of furniture. We're going to start with Exodus 19, but we'll be focusing a lot on Exodus 25. So that's what I would encourage you to look at before next week. So any closing thoughts?
Whenever God called me to go to the police this year,
Mm-hmm.
prior to that, I lost a mechanic, I lost an officer. And so Terry and I dealt with, okay, is he not, is it me want to go, or is God calling me? So we decided that it was. And a week and a half before